Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. I set off on my road trip late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway ahead. The urn with my mother's ashes rested beside me in the passenger seat. I hadn't planned on bringing them, but something felt wrong about leaving her behind, even if it was only a handful of dust. The idea of scattering her somewhere in the desert had seemed comforting at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like an impossible task. How could I rid myself of her? How could I rid myself of the years of tension and unspoken words? The wind whipped through the cracked windows, the warm air tugging at my hair, but it couldn't shake the cold that had settled in my chest. My mother's death had left a void, and I had no idea how to fill it. It wasn't just the loss that hurt. It was everything that had led up to it. The arguments, the silences, the things left unsaid. She'd been sick for months, but we never managed to make peace. I thought there'd be time, but there never was. The guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder that I had failed her in the end. The road stretched on, endless and flat, with nothing but scrubby brush and distant mountains to break the monotony. I'd been driving for hours, and the loneliness of it all was beginning to settle in. It was strange how quiet it was, even though I was surrounded by the vast openness of the desert. The sound of the tires against the asphalt was the only noise, and even that began to feel distant, as though I were fading into the landscape itself. I glanced at the rearview mirror and noticed a car behind me, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. It was too far behind to be threatening, but it was the way it stayed there, always just out of reach, that made my stomach churn. The car never tried to pass me, never slowed down or turned off. It was like it was tethered to me, attached to the space I occupied on this empty stretch of road. I shook it off at first, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just a coincidence. But as the miles stretched on, I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that had begun to creep up my spine. It wasn't long before I pulled into a gas station, hoping for a break from the oppressive quiet of the highway. The station was small, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in ages, and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above me did little to calm my nerves. The sedan pulled in behind me, its engine idling as I stepped out to fill the tank. The man who stepped out of the car wasn't anything extraordinary. Mid-40s, average height, dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans. But there was something in the way he moved, something unsettling about his calm, deliberate motions. He walked toward me slowly, a tight smile pulling at his lips. "You're out here alone?" he asked, his voice low but not unkind. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through." "Long way from anywhere," he said, glancing around at the empty desert surrounding us. "Car giving you trouble?" "No," I replied, my gaze flicking back to the sedan, now parked just a few feet away. There was something about the way he spoke, something off, but I couldn't place it. And good. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, before offering a thin smile again. "You look like you could use a break. I've been on the road for days, just trying to get to the next town. Might be nice to talk to someone for a while, you know." His words hung in the air like an invitation, but something about the offer felt hollow. I didn't trust him. I knew that much. But I wasn't sure why, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with that knowledge. The silence between us stretched on as I filled the tank. The man hadn't moved, his eyes still trained on me with an intensity that felt wrong. I shifted uneasily, not sure if I should make a polite excuse and leave, or if I should just let him talk and get it over with. Maybe it was the isolation of the place, or maybe it was just the heaviness of the grief I'd been carrying, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something about this strange man that kept me tethered, even though every instinct screamed at me to drive away. He shifted on his feet, and I could feel his gaze flicker toward the urn beside me, sitting innocently in the passenger seat. His eyes lingered for a moment too long, and the unsettling feeling deepened. I made the mistake of glancing at him. "Are you all right?" I asked, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. He tilted his head, studying me with a look that seemed to peel back the layers I'd spent so long trying to bury. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind," he said, his tone soft, almost sympathetic. I know how that feels. I froze, my heart racing. It was as though he could see through me. "I'm just trying to get away," I said, my voice shaky, unsure if I was lying to him or to myself. The words didn't seem to matter much anymore. Trying to find some peace, I guess. The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yeah, that's what we all want, isn't it? Peace. Some way to escape the weight of things." He stepped a little closer, and I instinctively took a step back, my hand instinctively brushing the keys in my pocket. "You know," he continued, his voice lowering slightly, "sometimes we can't run from our grief. It follows us. It stays with us until we let it go." I felt the blood drain from my face. His words. There was something chilling about them, like he was speaking directly to the heart of something I didn't want to confront. My grip tightened on the fuel nozzle, but I didn't speak. I just kept my eyes on him, trying to make sense of his words. "I don't know what you're talking about," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't need to say anything," he replied, his voice smooth, too smooth. "I can see it. I can sense it. You're carrying something heavy." He glanced briefly at the urn again, his gaze lingering for a moment before meeting my eyes. "I've been following you for a while, you know." My heart dropped. "What? You didn't notice, did you? The car behind you. It's been with you since the first stretch of highway," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I've been behind you for miles, just keeping pace, just watching." I took a step back, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. "What do you want from me?" The man's expression remained unchanged, but there was something predatory in his stare. "I told you, I can help you. Help you let go of what you're holding on to. Your grief, it doesn't have to control you." His words made my stomach twist. The way he spoke, like he knew me, like he knew my every thought. It was terrifying. I could feel the walls inside me starting to crack, but I was determined not to show it. "I don't need help," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. But the man didn't back off. Instead, he took another step closer, his presence filling the space between us. "You don't have to say that. You don't have to do this alone. I can help you find peace. We can leave all of this behind." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You're not the only one who's been running, Jesse. I know your story." The way he said my name, soft like he had been saying it for years, sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How could he know my name? I had never told him. I wanted to run, to get into my car and drive as fast as I could. But something in his presence, something almost hypnotic, made my legs feel like lead. He was closing in on me, too calm, too sure of himself. "Why don't you just let me help?" he repeated, his voice low, coaxing. "Let me make it stop. The pain, the guilt. I can take it away, Jesse. You don't have to carry it anymore." My mind raced, trying to process his words, but the only thing I could focus on was how wrong everything felt. This man, this stranger, was stalking me, playing on my grief, and the longer I stayed, the more I realized how dangerous he truly was. I didn't know what to do. My body screamed at me to get in the car and drive, to escape from this man who somehow knew too much. But my feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in place, caught in a web of unease and confusion. Every nerve in my body was telling me to run, but something else held me there, like a moth drawn to a flame. The words, "I can help you," echoed in my mind, the weight of his offer pressing down on me with an oppressive heaviness. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You're lying," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." He smiled again, the same unsettling, empty smile. "I don't need to know everything about you, Jesse. I just know what you're carrying, and I know how to help you carry it, or let it go." His eyes flicked back to the urn in my passenger seat, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glint of something almost predatory in his gaze. I couldn't take it any longer. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the car keys. The urge to escape, to put distance between myself and this man, was overwhelming. But before I could turn to go, he spoke again, his voice soft but insistent. You're not ready to face it, are you? To face the truth about your mother. The things you never said. The things you never got to make right. He stepped closer, his presence looming, and I instinctively took a step back. I've been following you for days because I know the pain you're hiding. I know it better than you think. A flash of anger ignited inside me. Stop it, I yelled, my voice rising despite myself. You don't know anything about me, about what I've been through. His eyes darkened, but he didn't seem angry. Just more intense, like he was trying to push deeper into my mind. You think you can outrun it, Jesse? You can't outrun grief. You can't outrun the guilt. He stepped even closer now, his breath steady, his eyes never leaving mine. But I can help you. I can take it all away. I clenched my fists at my sides, my thoughts racing. What did he want from me? Why was he so fixated on my pain? My grief had become a part of me, but I couldn't let it control me. I couldn't let him control me. I don't need you, I said, my voice cold. I don't need your help. He didn't back down. Instead, he just nodded, as though he had expected that response. In not asking, he said, his tone suddenly hard. I'm offering you a way out, a way to stop running. I glanced at the trunk of my car, the tire iron I had shoved in there just in case. The idea of using it against him felt wrong, but my mind was starting to slip, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I could feel the tension building, the desperation to escape creeping into my chest. What do you want? I asked, the words barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, weathered notebook. It was the kind of thing you might find in an old man's pocket, worn and stained with years of use. He opened it slowly, as if savoring the moment. I've been keeping track, he said softly, almost as if to himself. Of everyone I've helped. Of all the people I've set free. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. You're not the first, Jesse, but you might be the most interesting. I felt my heart beat faster. You've done this before. He didn't answer right away, but there was a gleam in his eye that told me everything I needed to know. The pit in my stomach grew deeper, and for the first time, I truly feared what this man might do if I didn't get away. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why me? He closed the notebook with a soft snap, his smile never wavering. You're broken. You're in pain, and I know how to fix it. I wasn't sure what terrified me more. The look in his eyes or the realization that I was trapped. The space between us felt too small, too suffocating. My hand moved to the tire iron in the trunk again, the weight of it suddenly feeling like my only lifeline. I wasn't sure what would happen if I confronted him. I wasn't sure if I could make it out of this unscathed. But I couldn't stand there, paralyzed, any longer. I couldn't let him continue to invade my mind, to manipulate me with his promises of peace. I took a step toward him, my mind made up. If he was going to take something from me, then I would make sure it was my life. I don't know what snapped inside me, but something in the pit of my stomach ignited, and I wasn't going to let this man control me anymore. The tire iron was still in the trunk, but the thought of holding it gave me a strange sense of power, like I was finally grabbing onto something solid, something that could defend me. I moved quickly, reaching behind me and yanking open the trunk. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the stillness of the night. I grabbed the tire iron, feeling its cold weight in my hand, and turned back to face the man. His expression shifted, though he didn't show fear. Only amusement. That's not going to help you, Jesse, he said softly, like he was speaking to a child. You can't stop this. You can't fight what's already inside you. Shut up, I shouted, more to shut out his voice than anything else. My grip tightened around the tire iron. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, but my hands were steady. I couldn't let him get inside my head again. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I couldn't let him touch me, couldn't let him get any closer. I'm not afraid of you, I said, my voice shaky, but trying to project strength. You're not afraid of me, Jesse. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, and the change sent a cold shiver down my spine. Then why do you look so terrified? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The air between us was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the pressure building inside me. The tire iron felt heavier in my hand, but it also felt like the only thing holding me together. The longer I stood there, the more his words wormed their way into my mind. I needed to strike, to act before I lost myself again. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low and persuasive. "I'm offering you an escape. A way out of all this pain. I can make you whole again, Jesse. Just let me help you." "No," I said, shaking my head violently. "I don't need your help. I'm not broken. I don't need you." My voice cracked as the words left my mouth. I was so tired of feeling broken, of feeling lost. But I knew now that whatever this man was offering, it was nothing but lies. "Then what do you need, Jesse?" he asked, his voice soft, almost coaxing. "What will it take to make you understand?" I could feel myself getting trapped again, the pull of his words wrapping around me like chains. But then something inside me clicked. I wasn't alone in this moment. I wasn't broken or weak. I was angry. I was angry at him, angry at my mother for leaving me with this mess, angry at myself for letting it all drag on for so long. Before I knew it, I swung the tire iron with all the force I could muster, the metal connecting with his side with a sickening thud. He gasped, stumbling back in surprise, and I followed through, swinging it again. This time, he didn't even try to stop me. He staggered, a look of shock spreading across his face. The moment the tire iron struck, everything seemed to freeze. I was breathing hard, my heart hammering in my chest. He was bent over, clutching his side, but there was no blood. No scream of pain, just an eerie silence hanging in the air. I took a step back, my hands still clenched around the tire iron, but this time I wasn't sure what to do next. I wasn't sure if he would get up, or if he would just disappear like some ghost. He was standing there, dazed, his expression unreadable. "I warned you," he said softly, his voice barely audible, but there was something different in his tone. Something darker. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Jesse. You can't escape me. Y'all will never be free." I felt the blood drain from my face. His words, the way he spoke, it was like he wasn't even human anymore. He wasn't a person, but something else entirely, something far worse. He took another step toward me, but I didn't wait. Without thinking, I turned and ran for the car, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were slick with sweat. I could hear his footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the door and fumbled with the handle, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the keys. I didn't even know if I could start the car, if I could make it out of there in time. But I didn't stop. I threw the door open, jumped into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't wait for the car to warm up or the engine to settle. I just floored the accelerator, tearing down the empty road, my heart pounding in my ears. The headlights illuminated the darkness ahead of me, and all I could think of was getting away from him. Getting away from everything. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I was safe. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I drove. And drove. The road stretched out before me like a never-ending ribbon of asphalt, the headlights illuminating the empty, desolate stretch of land ahead. The night seemed to grow darker the further I went, the silence pressing in on me like a thick fog. My mind raced, still reeling from what had just happened. I couldn't stop thinking about Cole. His eyes, his words. He hadn't been human. He couldn't have been. No one could manipulate someone the way he had, could press so deep into my pain with such eerie precision. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The road felt like it was swallowing me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I glanced at the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the glow of headlights following me, to hear the sound of tires on the road behind me. But there was nothing. No car. No pursuit. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, its presence so suffocating that it made it hard to breathe. My breath was shallow, my chest tight, but I forced myself to focus on the road. I needed to keep moving. I glanced over at the urn resting in the passenger seat. My mother's ashes. The weight of them felt heavier now, more ominous. I had been carrying them with me on this trip, as if some part of me hoped the journey would bring me peace. would somehow make up for everything I hadn't done, all the words I hadn't said. But what if the ashes weren't the problem? What if it was me? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. I couldn't keep going down that path. Not now. But the thought wouldn't leave. The grief, the guilt. It was all tangled up inside of me, gnawing at me, reminding me of all the things I hadn't said to my mother. All the things I had pushed down for so long. I thought running away from it all would help me get away from the pain. But Cole had been right in one way. I couldn't outrun it. My eyes blurred with unshed tears, and I wiped my face angrily. No, I wasn't going to let myself fall apart again. Not like this. I had already done that once. Letting myself get lost in the haze of grief, of guilt. I had to be strong. I had to keep moving. But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't that simple. It had never been that simple. The road began to twist and turn, taking me deeper into the heart of nowhere. The landscape around me had turned barren. Nothing but cracked earth and dry brush. The further I drove, the more the world seemed to fall away, the horizon swallowed by a never-ending stretch of darkness. It was like I had crossed some invisible line, and now I was out of reach, lost in some other world where nothing made sense. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I was exhausted. My eyes were heavy, and my body ached with the tension of the last few hours. I glanced at the gas gauge. Empty. The needle was teetering on E, and I knew I needed to find a station soon or risk running out of fuel completely. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know if there were any gas stations around. But there was one thing I did know. I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay in one place for too long. Not with Cole out there. Just as the thought crossed my mind, I saw it. A tiny speck of light in the distance, a flicker in the dark. I focused on it, trying to make out what it was, but my mind was too clouded with fear to process it properly. But it was close. Close enough that I could see the outline of a small, run-down building. A gas station. Relief surged through me. I couldn't believe my luck. I had found one, just when I thought I was too far gone. I hit the brakes, slowing the car, and pulled into the station, my heart pounding. The place was quiet. Too quiet. The lights were dim, and the air felt still, but it didn't matter. I needed fuel. I needed to rest. I parked the car and hesitated for a moment before getting out. My hands were shaking, but I managed to open the door and step onto the cracked pavement. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and oil. The station was eerily silent, like the kind of place that had long been forgotten by everyone except travelers like me. I walked to the pump, but the moment I reached for the nozzle, I stopped. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked around, scanning the darkened lot, and then my stomach dropped. There was a car parked in the far corner, its headlights off, but its engine still running. The car from before. My pulse quickened as I stared at the car. The same beat-up sedan. The same cold, eerie presence. I could feel my stomach twist into a knot, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled in warning. No, this couldn't be happening. I hadn't seen it for miles, and now. Here it was, parked, waiting, its engine humming like a predator's breath. I glanced at the gas pump in my hand, the nozzle still hovering above the tank. I didn't know why I hadn't just left. Maybe I thought I could get away, that I could outrun this feeling of dread. But now, with the car right there, my body was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind was too clouded with memories of Cole's voice, his presence, his twisted need to control everything. It felt like a trap, one I couldn't escape. I forced myself to step away from the pump, my eyes never leaving the car in the corner of the lot. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands slick with sweat. I knew I needed to get back in the car, to leave before he found me. But the thought of that man walking out from behind the vehicle made my heart race faster. His words echoed in my mind. "You'll never be free." Before I could take another step, a door creaked open. I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure step out from the shadows, walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. My heart skipped a beat. It was him. Cole. He didn't say a word as he approached, his face expressionless, like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't in any hurry. His movements were calculated, controlled, like he was savoring the moment. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back, my mind racing. What was he going to do? What did he want now? You should have kept driving, Jesse, he said softly, his voice low but still carrying that same unsettling calmness. You could have kept running, but now you're here and you've come back to me. I shook my head, trying to gather my bearings. This wasn't happening. He couldn't be real. He couldn't have been following me all this time, not after everything. I wasn't going to let him drag me back into whatever sick game he was playing. "I'm not coming back," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "You don't control me." A small, amused smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and it made my blood run cold. "Oh, Jesse," he murmured, "you never really left. I've been with you this whole time, haven't I? In your thoughts and your grief. You think you can outrun me, but you're wrong." I swallowed hard, taking another step back. My foot brushed against something cold, a metal object. The tire iron. I hadn't even realized I was holding it, but now it felt like my only lifeline, my only chance at survival. I lifted it up, holding it between us, and said the only words that made sense in that moment. "Stay back." He didn't flinch. His eyes flickered down to the tire iron, then back to me, almost like he was disappointed. "You're still so scared, Jesse. You can feel it, can't you? That anger, that pain. It's all inside of you. I can make it go away. All you have to do is let me." I shook my head, the anger rising within me, pushing away the fear, the doubt. "No, I'm not letting you control me anymore. I'm done." Something shifted in his eyes. It was like the mask had slipped, and the darkness underneath was clearer than ever. "You can't escape yourself," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The more you run, the closer I get." I didn't listen to him. I couldn't. My body moved before my mind could catch up, and I swung the tire iron at him with everything I had. It connected with a sickening thud, knocking him back a step. For a moment I thought he might fall, but he just stood there, unaffected, as if the hit hadn't fazed him at all. I swung again, this time aiming for his chest, but he caught my arm mid-swing, his grip vice-like. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. My heart raced, panic rising, and then I heard it. His voice, cold and final. "You don't know how to fight this, Jesse. You never will." He wasn't wrong. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just swinging, desperate to stop him from getting any closer. My whole body shook, and for a split second, I thought he was going to overpower me, to drag me into whatever nightmare he had planned. But then, something inside me snapped. A deep breath. A moment of clarity. I wasn't going to let this happen again. I wasn't going to let him win. I twisted my arm free from his grip, slamming the tire iron into his stomach with all the force I could muster. This time, when I hit him, it felt different. His grip loosened. He stumbled backward, gasping for air. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, the sound of my feet pounding against the pavement echoing in my ears. I didn't know if he was still following me, but I didn't care. I couldn't look back. I couldn't stop. I had to leave him behind. I threw myself into the car, slamming the door shut and starting the engine without hesitation. The car roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away from the station without looking back. The road ahead was still empty, but I wasn't alone anymore. I had finally let go of the guilt, of the grief, of the fear. I had stopped running. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect. But it would be mine. The road was long, but I had learned something important tonight. I didn't need to run anymore. When I finally graduated high school, I knew exactly how I wanted to spend my gap year before selling my soul to a college for 6 years. I wanted to hit the road and see as much of America as possible. Get in my car and hit the interstate coast to coast. My parents were hesitant about allowing me to go at first, thinking I might go all into the wild on them, but I assured them that after my grand adventure, I would return safely back to the East Coast and begin my college studies. And so they agreed and loaned me about $5,000 in an emergency fund in case I needed to pay for anything. Although I wasn't planning on staying in any fancy hotels, I wanted this to be an experience just as much as a vacation, so I planned to live exclusively in my car the whole journey. Kissing my parents goodbye and plugging California into my GPS, I hit the road with a suitcase full of clothes, a backpack full of books and snacks, and a mind ready to find itself out there on the road. Now I could bore you all with my stories of crossing the country, from the time in the Appalachians when I saw a bear and a raccoon fight over a sandwich, or one time in Ohio when I could have sworn I saw Bigfoot, or even the time while resting on the banks of the Mississippi where I watched two dudes battling a raft up the river Huckleberry Finn style. No, that's not why you're here. You're here to know about the mansion I stumbled upon. Now, I had left the East Coast right at the tail end of summer in August. I had hoped to get to the Rockies in time before it started snowing. But I also was taking my time and enjoying the trip, living my life as I wanted, and even resting a few days at the same rest stop to take a break from driving. Unfortunately for me, Mother Nature had other ideas about when she wanted it to start snowing. I was driving through the Great Plains, marveling at the endless flat plains, when the first snow began to fall in mid-October. I decided to stop at a rest stop and wait the first storm out. Unfortunately for me, it was full of truckers thinking the same thing I had. I didn't mind at all. After all, there isn't a harder job than being a long-haul trucker, so I continued on the road, hopeful that I'd find a new rest area. I drove a few more miles, happy that I had decided to get a full tank of gas a few miles back. I made sure to turn the heater on and bundle up with the winter jacket I had been thankful that my mother had forced on me. It was smooth sailing until the snowstorm turned into a full-blown blizzard. My phone vibrated, alerting me to the terrible weather conditions. Now my car is old, a hand-me-down from my uncle, and her tires are not good in the best conditions, so you can imagine how badly she was handling in a blizzard. I was thankful that I was the only one stupid enough to try driving in the weather because my car began drifting in and out of the lanes of traffic. I pulled over to the side of the road finally and laid back in my seat, thinking over my options. Looking at my phone, I saw that there wasn't another rest stop for at least 20 miles. Not terrible at all in normal weather. In a blizzard, it was certain death. But if I stayed here on the side of the road, I ran the risk of my car getting snowed in and trapped. Not to mention a snowplow just showing up and burying my car in even more snow. So I was presented with two unfavorable options. Risk the weather and keep driving towards the rest stop, or wait for the storm to blow over on the side of the road. And I made the worst decision. Deciding to just drive slow and go for the rest stop, I started my car back up and returned to trying to drive in the increasingly difficult to navigate weather. I told myself that if it got too bad, I would just pull over and wait. I kept driving for about another half mile, barely going 10 miles per hour in fear of my car spinning out and sending me into a ditch. Vision dropped to just barely past my high beams, and I was seriously starting to question my choice. As I made it about a mile and a half, something ran across the road. At the time I thought it might have been a deer. It sprinted across the road, and I was barely able to catch it in my headlights. In a panic, I quickly turned to avoid it, and in the process sent my car into a hard spin. My poor traction sent me straight off into the road, and my car ended up hanging off the edge of a bridge that was over a small stream. I woke up suddenly, with my face deep in my airbag. The impact had been enough to deploy them, and I was thankful that at least they worked and saved me from ending up more injured than I was, which amounted to a few aching ribs and some cuts on my face. I looked around the car and assessed my situation, and finally decided I was done. My car was stuck in a shallow stream. Judging by my lack of heater, the battery had been damaged, and I was stuck in a blizzard. God, I muttered to myself as I winced in pain and unbuckled myself from my chair. Already I could feel my body starting to shiver despite my body being clothed in several layers of warm clothing. I quickly grabbed my bag and started searching for something that could help. Then I quickly tossed it in the passenger seat when I realized it was the bag full of books, and grabbed the useful bag that my dad had given me. He always was one to be prepared for things like this to happen, and to my joy, I found a mini shovel and a road flare in the backpack. "You're the best, Dad," I said through chattering teeth. I reached over to the dash to get my phone, only to realize it wasn't on its mount anymore. I looked around the car for it, but couldn't find it anywhere. I elected to find it later once I could assess the car's damage. Opening the door with some difficulty, I was immediately blasted with a gush of freezing cold air in the face. Escaping my car, I quickly lit one of the road flares and walked around my car to assess the damage. The front end was bent upward, and it was clear that even if I dug it out and got it off of the edge of the bridge, there was no way I was driving it anywhere. I tossed the flare to the floor and quickly returned to the car, cursing my bad luck and renewing the search for my phone. I finally discovered it underneath the passenger seat. To my relief, it still worked, albeit with a large crack on it, but unfortunately, I had no reception at all. I had downloaded the map earlier to be able to know where I was going in a no-reception area like here. But now I was in the middle of nowhere, trapped in a snowstorm, and in desperate need of reception. I decided to try calling 911, but although I managed to get through, I couldn't understand a word of what the operator was saying, as they just sounded like a jumbled mess of sounds and words. Slamming my head back against my seat, I began breathing on my hands, trying to keep them warm as I tried to think of a way out of this. If it really came down at it, I figured I could maybe use one of the road flares to build a campfire. Or hope and pray that a snowplow saw my road flares and stopped to help me. I wrapped my arms around myself to keep my body as warm as I could. I closed my eyes and sat there shivering for a moment. It was like I could feel all my body heat beginning to leave my body. I must have fallen asleep there shivering when suddenly someone knocked on my window. I flinched awake, suddenly painfully aware of just how cold I was. My body shivered uncontrollably, and taking a quick look up at my rearview mirror, I was scared to see my face was bright red from the cold. I looked over at my window and noticed that a heavily jacketed figure was standing there at my door. I was so happy to see another human, I nearly reached out and kissed them on the spot. Quickly opening the door, the howling wind quickly shut off any conversation we might have had. I didn't know how long I had fallen asleep, but it had been enough for the entire area to suddenly transform into Antarctica. The jacketed figure motioned towards me and then pointed at a car that was also pulled over to the side of the road. They motioned for me to follow. I nodded at them and quickly gathered my 2 backpacks, following after them as the snow and wind continued to slap my freezing face over and over. They opened the passenger door for me, and I quickly entered and was immediately greeted with the heater on at full blast. I quickly shoved my completely numb fingers against the vents. They were even redder than my face was, and I was thankful that this person had found me. They soon entered the driver's seat and pulled down their hood, revealing themselves as an exhausted-looking woman. She looked to be in her 50s and looked more like a disappointed school teacher than a guardian angel. But I didn't care at all. She had just saved my life. T, thank you so much. I told her through chattering teeth. I almost hit a deer or something, and I almost ended up in the stream. I told her as I desperately tried to get more heat into my body. She nodded and looked me over. She seemed disappointed in something at first, but she quickly pointed out into the storm. You're lucky to have crashed so close to my patient's house. I looked at her in confusion. As far as I knew, I had been driving past an enormous nature preserve, at least according to my GPS. I shall take you up to his house to warm you up. He shall decide what we do from there, she told me, as she put the car in drive and slowly drove up the road. The way she spoke seemed so empty, like how a robot might talk to a person. But I figured from what Shed just said, and by the look of her, that she was a nurse. So maybe she was just exhausted. I'm sure I didn't sound much better, chattering like a cartoon character with every sentence. We rode in silence as the car had amazing grip and navigated the snowed-out road without any hassle at all. Soon we came upon a section of barbed wire fence. She told me to wait in the car as she bundled back up and exited back out into the blizzard. I tried to see where she was going, but visibility was so bad that I lost sight of her as soon as she exited into the storm. I waited a moment, still soaking up as much heat as I could. Soon she returned to the car, and without another word, she drove toward the fence. I thought for a second that she was just going to run the fence over, but instead, we drove through a gate that she had opened in the fence. After she exited again to close the fence, we proceeded out into the unknown. I could have sworn we were off-roading for sections of the drive, and yet this little car handled it like nobody's business, and soon a building came into sight. It was a massive plantation-style house, something straight out of Gone with the Wind. Who lives here? I thought this whole area was a nature preserve. I looked over at my savior. She gave me a side eye as she continued to drive us toward the front of the giant plantation mansion. The crushing silence continued until she finally put the car in park and turned to stare at me. This is the house of Monsieur Jack and LeBlanc. Hopefully, he will allow you to stay until the blizzard passes. She sighed and unbuckled her seatbelt. I nodded and did the same, only then realizing just how badly my ribs hurt. My pain must have been obvious as she looked over at me. I suggest we head inside so I may assess your situation. She opened the door and exited out into the whirling snowstorm. I sat in the car for a few more moments to enjoy the heat, before heading out with my savior, grabbing my backpacks and braving the snow. Once I was inside the mansion, I was amazed by how beautiful everything was inside. Elaborate oil paintings hung from the walls, mostly of scenes of nature and of birds. On several pedestals were giant vases that looked to be from ancient Greece, and thankfully for my freezing body, it was nice and warm. I dropped my 2 backpacks carefully onto the hardwood floor and marveled at the beauty that the mansion had on display. My name is Audrey. I'm Monsieur Leblanc's nurse. Audrey finally introduced herself to me as she took off her coat and walked over to me to take mine. I started taking it off, but immediately let out a pained grunt and doubled over in pain. Audrey quickly came over to me and caught me before I fell to the floor completely. Miss Audrey, have you brought in someone from the cold? Another female's voice pulled my attention back up from the floor to look over at the source of the voice. A maid was standing in the doorway, with a similar look that Audrey had in her eyes. Tired, hollow, robotic tone of voice. I almost thought that they were related. I discovered him trapped in the snow. Poor thing seems to be in pain. Audrey told the maid as she helped me walk over to one of the nearby fancy resting chairs. I sat down and allowed Audrey to fully take my several coats off. She pulled my shirt up and let out a quick, "Oh dear," fall out of her lips. I looked down and quickly regretted doing so as I saw the enormous bruising forming from where my seatbelt had stopped me from going through my windshield. She quickly dropped my shirt back down and walked over to the nurse. The two discussed something as I sat in the chair, the pain starting to throb up from my ribs. "Can you walk, mister?" Audrey and the maid walked over to me. For the first time since I'd met her, Audrey actually displayed an emotion. She looked worried over my condition, while the maid seemed to be annoyed at the melting snow that had started to melt onto the floor. "Nathan. And yeah, I think I can." I told Audrey as I pushed myself up from the chair and staggered to my feet. Audrey offered me her arm to help support me, and I readily accepted it. She led me down the extravagant halls and over to a room that revealed itself to be a simple bedroom. "Take your shirt off completely. I want to make sure you aren't about to bleed out internally," she told me as she helped me sit down on the bed. I nodded as I noticed the maid had brought my 2 backpacks and my jackets, and managed to pull my shirt off with much pain and effort. Audrey produced a stethoscope and began to carefully listen to my vitals. She examined me as carefully as she could, but I still let out a few pained grunts. "Lucky you that only one of your ribs is broken. Without an X-ray, I can't assess more of the damage, and with this storm, I doubt that an ambulance can get to you." She spared a glance over at the maid who was hovering over her like an angel of death. "Until the storm passes, y'all stay here. We will speak to Monsieur Leblanc about this, as I'm sure he will want to meet his guest." Audrey stood up and looked at the maid who stared back at her before turning to exit. "I'll return with some ice for the bruising, and something to help ease your pain." Audrey bowed at me before leaving me alone in the room before I could thank her. I wanted to lie down on the bed, but even just turning my body to look down at the mattress was too much pain for me to handle. Instead, I walked over to my bag and started to search for a book to read, hoping that doing something other than just sitting there with this throbbing pain would take my mind off of my ribs. A few minutes later, I heard what sounded like a cart being wheeled towards my room. I quickly placed my bookmark into the book and sat it down on the bed, expecting that Audrey had arrived with the promised ice and pain relief. Instead, I was met with an old wooden wheelchair with what appeared to be a man sitting in it. His face was covered by a silver mask, and he wheezed something fierce from his wheelchair. A large blanket covered his lower body, and it looked like he was a few hard wheezes away from death. I stood up from the bed carefully, feeling the need to stand in my host's presence. It's not often that we have visitors, especially in weather such as this. The man's voice was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was as if a speaker was playing a clear voice from somewhere, as if he was communicating to me through a scarily good text-to-speech device. I crashed my car not far from your beautiful house. Audrey found me and saved me before I froze to death, I said with a small chuckle, quickly regretting it when my ribs screamed in pain at the sudden movements of my lungs and diaphragm. Yes, it was quite fortunate of her to find you. The man took in a deep wheezing breath before he flopped his head over to the side to look towards his maid. You could not have gotten him a better room than this one, he asked her. His strange voice sounded disappointed, but it was like he was pretending to be disappointed. Well, monsieur, this was the only room we had ready. She looked over at me before quickly finishing her sentence. She leaned down and whispered something into his ear. He sat there breathing momentarily before taking in another deep wheeze. I hope the room is to your liking. Audrey will attend to you after she has seen to my needs. I hope to see you for dinner. The maid quickly took hold of the wheelchair and spun it around to exit the room before I could even answer him. I let out a sigh, quickly regretting that also as my ribs cried out in pain. I wanted to join them as I sat there on the bed, really hoping for Audrey and her pain relief. But judging by how badly LeBlanc seemed to be ill, I didn't really mind her taking long. And to my immense joy, she soon showed up with the promised ice and painkillers. So, I asked her as she carefully wrapped my torso in bandages. What's wrong with LeBlanc? I asked, trying to make conversation, while also wanting to be nosy. Seeing what looked like a living corpse with a silver mask on his face was enough to rouse anyone's curiosity. She looked at me for a moment before glancing over at the door. Monsieur, which you will address him as from here on out, has a genetic condition. It is the plague of his family, unfortunately, she said as she took my hand and sprinkled 2 pills into my palm. If you're truly curious, you can ask him yourself at dinner. She watched me take the pills and handed me a glass of water to wash it down. I swallowed with some difficulty but managed to get the pills and water down easily enough. What do I wear? As nice as these bandages are, I doubt this is proper dining attire. Audrey flashed me a smile for the first time since we'd met. It felt like seeing a quadruple rainbow in the sky. My clothes are in my suitcase, which is still in my car, I told her. Audrey nodded and looked over at the wardrobe in my room. I'll ask Jane if we have anything that will fit you. After she finished up with her quick checkup of me, she left me alone again in the room. Feeling the effects of the painkillers, I was able to walk easier. I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back, staring out into the great white void. As I was about to leave the windowsill, I looked down at where my hands were. Scratched into the windowsill were the words, "Save me." I stared at these words for a moment. Was this some kind of joke? Or, Master Nathan, I've brought you a fresh pair of clothes. I hope these will fit you. The maid, who I assumed was the Jane that Audrey had mentioned before, entered my room. I quickly turned to look at her, covering up the writing that I had discovered on the windowsill. Oh, thank you, Jane. She seemed happier than when I had first met her. I suppose that now that LeBlanc had met me and agreed to my staying here, she had decided to treat me like a guest. I walked over and accepted the pile of clothes. As I looked down at them, I noticed that one of the white dress shirts had a giant stain on it. Jane seemed to notice it at the same time as me, as she quickly pulled it back from me and hid it behind her back. She had a big smile on her face the whole time. Seems a dirty one found itself in there. She gave a little giggle as I stared at her with bewilderment. Before I could ask her about the stain, she quickly turned to leave. Just as she exited into the hallway, she turned back to look at me. That smile on her face had grown larger and off-putting. Monsieur is waiting for you in the dining room. She waved goodbye to me before closing the door. I felt my whole body involuntarily shiver at the interaction I'd just had with Jane. With some difficulty, I managed to put on one of the dress shirts provided for me and slip on the dress pants as well. They fit me surprisingly well for seemingly being clothes that were just lying around this mansion. Not wanting to keep LeBlanc waiting, I exited the hall and returned to the mansion's entrance, hopeful that someone would be waiting there to guide me toward the dining room. Unfortunately for me, Jane was standing here, waiting for me. "You clean up rather well." She walked over and fussed with my hair like a mom would when her son tries to leave with a tangled mess of bed hair. I let her do it before following her down the hall towards a far door that led into the dining room. LeBlanc was already seated at the head of the table. A small feast was laid out on the great wooden table, with several cloches covering trays, all ready to be served. "Nathan, our guest, is here, monsieur." Jane introduced me, bowing her head towards the decrepit figure in the wheelchair. Audrey was standing by his side, keeping a watchful eye over him. I bowed my head slightly, still not able to bend much at all with my ribs in such pain. Jane pulled out one of the wooden chairs for me to sit down at, and with some effort, I managed to sit myself down. While I was starving after my whole ordeal, and having not eaten in 2 days while on the road, I just wanted to go to sleep in my new bed. But I was a guest at this mansion, so I had to be respectful. "I hope the food is to your liking," LeBlanc wheezed out, his voice seemingly being unaffected by the silver mask strapped to his face. "You arrived on such short notice, we did not have time to prepare a proper meal." LeBlanc sat in his chair wheezing as he stared at me through the black eye holes in his mask. "I'm sure whatever it is that you prepared for me is lovely, monsieur," I said with my best smile. The more I looked at LeBlanc, the worse my sense of danger became. Something about him rubbed a spot on the uncanny valley. His breathing, his movements, his voice, just about everything about him seemed like something pretending to be a human. Jane uncovered one of the cloches and revealed a large roast of meat with veggies and a platter filled with bread rolls. She served me some on a large silver plate, and I stared at the meal for a moment, before looking over at LeBlanc and realizing that no food was sitting in front of him. "You're not going to eat, monsieur?" I asked him as I took the silver fork and knife into my hands and began to poke and prod at the meat before me. LeBlanc took a loud wheezing breath as his head flopped over to the side to look up at Audrey before he flopped it back over to me. "Unfortunately, my condition inhibits my ability to eat properly. I would not wish to burden you with the sight of me eating." He sat there wheezing. That explanation seemed to have taken him an incredible amount of effort to explain. I quickly nodded and returned to my meal, cutting into the meat and starting to eat it along with the veggies. It tasted like pork, but the way the meat acted when I tried to cut it was more like beef. I sat there in silence trying to figure out what the meat was, before Jane brought forth a pitcher of wine and filled my cup with it. I silently thanked her for it before grabbing the glass and taking a small sip of it. It was some of the best wine I'd ever tasted. I spared another glance at LeBlanc and saw a torrent of saliva falling from underneath his mask. Audrey quickly noticed this as well, and she quickly wiped it away with an available handkerchief. I sat my wine glass down and quickly looked around for anything to distract myself from. "An ancestor of yours, monsieur?" I pointed toward a large oil painting of a man in a wheelchair, but in what looked to be an old military uniform. He also had a similar mask that LeBlanc was wearing now, although the one in the painting was ornately carved as opposed to the current one. LeBlanc looked over to where I was pointing, and seemed to be confused for a moment before he nodded slowly. "François LeBlanc, Comte de Vermandois, was wounded at the Battle of Waterloo. My family goes very far back," he explained, some excess spit sliding down his chin. I nodded a bit before returning to my meal and focusing more on the veggies and bread than the strange mystery meat. "May I ask then, monsieur, what you're doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" A noble French aristocrat hanging out in the Great Plains didn't exactly make much sense to me. He stared at me for a moment, and a strange cracking sound started to emanate from him. Audrey quickly leaned over and whispered something into his ear again. "You'll have to excuse us, Nathan. The hour is late, and I must put monsieur to bed," Audrey explained, quickly taking hold of the chair and rolling LeBlanc away before I could get any kind of answer to my question. I put down my knife and fork and also stood up. "I'd better be getting to bed as well then," I told Jane as she hovered around me like a fly. "Thank you for the food, Jane," I told her, walking past her and heading back towards where my room was. I had been lucky to have paid attention to where Jane had led me because the mansion was a giant maze of hallways and doorways, all of it adorned with paintings and artifacts. I had to wonder just how rich LeBlanc was. Finally arriving back at my room, I breathed a sigh of relief as I closed the door and locked it from behind. I walked back over to the windowsill and stared down at the message still scratched into it. I then stared back into the blizzard still raging outside. The wind whipped and whistled loudly, and I could practically hear clumps of snow falling from the sky. I walked back over to my new bed and sat gently before unbuttoning my dress shirt. I decided to see if any kind of pajamas had been left around for me, seeing as I didn't want to sleep naked in a stranger's bed, in this weather as well. Despite the house being old, it had good enough heating, but I could tell that cold was still seeping in from the crack in the wall and the like. Opening the wardrobe, I was met with another message scratched into the wood. The words, "monster" and "help me" were clawed into the wardrobe with what looked like human fingers, because sticking out of one of the words was a broken piece of fingernail. I quickly slammed the empty wardrobe shut, and as I did I heard someone trying to open the door to my room. "Who is it?" I called out, quickly walking over to my backpack and searching for anything that I might use as a weapon. I still had 2 road flares left, my small foldable shovel, and a tire repair kit. I quickly opened this and pulled out the sharp reamer tool to use as a weapon. "It's Jane," her voice answered. "I brought you some pajamas." She explained. The sound of jingling keys alerted me to the futility of locking the door in the first place. I quickly hid the reamer tool behind my back as she finally found the correct key to open my door. She was all smiles as she hung the giant key ring back onto her belt and approached me with my pajamas all folded neatly. Tucking the tool into my waistband, I reached out and took the pajamas from her. Without a word, she bowed slightly and saw herself out. Whether she suspected me of doing something, I couldn't tell. But as soon as she was gone, I quickly closed and locked the door. But this time I also grabbed one of the sitting chairs and pushed it up against the door. Something messed up is going on here, I thought to myself as I quickly changed into my PJs and looked around for any further evidence. But those words were the only ones that I discovered. I quickly sat in bed, and despite how tired I was, I decided that no matter what, I wasn't going to sleep. It was an uphill battle. I already hadn't slept in 2 days, and now I was in pain from a car crash, medicated on painkillers, and had a glass of wine. The odds were stacked against me. I paced around in my room, flinching at every creak and moan of the old house as the blizzard battered it from the outside. I was almost thankful for the fact that there were so few trees out here. If I had seen the shadow of a tree at that moment in the window, I very well might have shit myself. I constantly checked my phone for updates, but with no signal at all and the blizzard still raging, it was going to be a long night. Around 3:40 in the morning, as I was losing the battle to stay awake, I heard something tapping on my door. That was enough to jolt me awake, so I quickly reached for my bag and the reamer tool and held my breath to listen and try to see what was attempting to enter my room. It tried to open the door, but when it found it was locked, I heard a low hiss. I gripped the handle of the reamer tool tightly and waited to see what would happen next. It all happened in a flash, as loud banging started on the heavy door. I quickly shot out of the bed and grabbed my bags. The banging continued, only growing louder and more intense. The door was solid wood, and I was hopeful that whatever was pounding on the door wasn't strong enough to break the door down. It wasn't, but the hinges for the door were unfortunately not strong enough to withstand the force of the thing on the other side of the door, and with a loud crash the door was knocked from its hinges and fell through my room and crushed the chair I had pressed against it to splinters. Nothing. My mouth fell to the floor as I watched LeBlanc crawl through the door. Gone was the wheelchair. He was crawling on all fours, or rather on all 6 limbs. A set of long insect-like legs had sprouted from his body, and he looked like what a centaur would look like if it was mixed with some sort of bug. Where his chin was supposed to be, a large mouth with rows of sharp teeth and pincers revealed themselves. "Oh hell no," I shouted, grabbing into my bag and quickly reaching for one of the road flares. As I did, he pounced on me and began to slash me with his long claws. I shouted and grunted as I tried to block his flurry of attacks. Slobber fell from his mouth onto me, and to block him from biting anything important, I quickly shoved my arm into his mouth to block him. I screamed in pain as he slammed his jaws shut, and a loud, sickening crunch and squelch came from my arm. I fumbled desperately in my bag before finally pulling out the road flare, despite only having one good arm and one being chewed to pieces by a giant bug creature in a fancy suit. But to my immense relief, I managed to light the flare to life. LeBlanc let out a loud and painful screech as I quickly shoved the flaming object into his neck. He loosened his grip on me, and to add insult to injury, I also slammed the reamer tool into his neck with it. LeBlanc screeched and shoved himself off of me as brown juice began to leak from the hole I had made in his neck. I got to my feet as quickly as I could and ran out into the hall. Turning back, I tossed the flare at LeBlanc. I stumbled out into the hall and winced in pain as I stared down at the mangled mess of meat my arm had been turned into. As I exited into the main hall and stumbled towards the entrance, I noticed Jane was carrying fresh bed sheets. Our gazes met, and she dropped the clean blankets to the floor. I reached toward my bag for the last flare in case I needed it. "How did you escape?" Before I could answer her question, a screech from behind me clued me to LeBlanc having been right behind me. I slowly turned to see him sprinting full force toward me. In a flash of a moment, I jumped out of the way and slammed myself to the floor, letting out a pained yell as my ribs screamed out in pain. I managed to catch a glimpse of LeBlanc leaping toward where I had been standing mere milliseconds before. But instead of tackling me, he was now on track to tackle Jane to the floor. LeBlanc tackled Jane to the floor, and seemingly undaunted by the fact he had the wrong target, began to rip her to shreds. He ripped her limb from limb and ate the pieces he ripped from her. As he was blocking my escape route, I quickly shoved myself up and ran toward the nearest set of stairs in the hallway. I clutched my ribs as I ran up the stairs. Every breath I took felt like a stab into my lungs. Making it to the top floor, I started to try and force open any of the doors upstairs, but none of them were unlocked. "Run, little rabbit, run." LeBlanc's voice alerted me as I was trying to force open a door. I quickly whipped my head back toward the stairs and watched him crawling up them, slowly and methodically, with blood and pieces of cloth sticking to his teeth. "I love it when you run." He let out a series of clicks and cracks from his body. His mouth didn't move at all as he spoke. Instead, he simply let it hang open, and the words seemed to just come out. I turned to try and open any of the other doors on that floor as LeBlanc slowly made his way toward me. The sick man was enjoying the fact I was struggling and squirming. Finally, to my small relief, I found a door that was unlocked, and quickly I ran inside and locked the door behind me. It wouldn't hold him for long, but I only needed a few seconds. The room was completely barren of furniture, so I had to use my backpack full of books to break the window in the room. I threw it against the window and winced as it shattered into a storm of glass. The blizzard blew its harsh wind through the newly opened window, and I was alerted painfully so to the fact I was only wearing a pair of pajamas. I was presented with two options: freezing to death outside or being ripped to shreds inside the mansion. I took my chances. Crawling out the window and staring down at the large drop before me, I was given a metaphorical push out of the window when LeBlanc smashed his way through the door. Without even bothering to look back, I leaped out of the window and landed in the snow below. Almost immediately, I could feel the cold deep into my bones, and it felt like a million little knives were cutting into my skin. In the darkness and mixed with the harsh and uncaring blizzard, visibility was absolutely zero. With my hands trembling uncontrollably, I reached into my backpack and pulled out the final flare. Lighting it and holding it above my head, I started trying to walk toward the highway. I barely managed to get a few steps when I heard the crunching of snow behind me. Flashing the flare towards the sound, I let out a scream as I saw LeBlanc crawling his way through the snow toward me. Now given even more fresh motivation to get away, I started crawling through the snow as quickly as I could. The snow at this point was just above my waist, and trying to run away was nearly impossible. But there was a silver lining: the same weather that was hindering my escape was also hindering LeBlanc's pursuit of me. I crawled my way through the snow and didn't dare try and see how close LeBlanc was behind me. The sound of the snow and the wind was just enough to cover the crunching of the snow as he chased me. I thought I might escape. That was until I tripped on an unseen rock. I fell face first into the snow and dropped the flare down with me as well. I thought for sure that I was about to join Jane, and who knew how many other people LeBlanc had eaten. I lay there in the snow and waited for what was going to happen to me. I heard the crunching of the snow grow closer and closer as LeBlanc crawled over to where I had fallen. He stood there for a moment, but to my confusion, he didn't begin to eat me. I slowly turned my head to try and see what was happening. The flare was still burning and was able to illuminate LeBlanc as he looked around in what looked like confusion. He let out more clicks and his body shivered. He leaned his head down to where the flare was burning, illuminating him before he pulled away. "Nathan," he shouted. He let out a loud screech again before he started walking again, following the path I had been taking. I lifted my head from the snow and watched him disappear into the darkness of the blizzard. It then hit me. LeBlanc is blind and uses what has to be an echolocation and most likely smell to find his prey. In the blizzard, and with my body buried in snow, he couldn't see me. I lay there in the snow for a few minutes, waiting until the flare finally died and I was plunged into complete darkness. I waited some more before I stood up and started walking again. Every little noise I heard from the blizzard forced me to quickly hunker down in the snow and wait for the noise to pass. Finally, I made it to the highway. My body was shivering uncontrollably and I was struggling to stay awake. I had lost all feeling in my arms and legs, but despite this, I continued to walk up the highway, hoping and praying that a snowplow would be out. I made it another quarter of a mile before I collapsed into the snow and passed out. When I awoke, it was in a hospital bed. A snowplow had discovered me unconscious in the middle of the highway. I was barely alive and already had frostbite on many of my fingers and toes. I lost 2 fingers on my left hand and 1 on my right and lost 4 toes in total. But I had survived. I tried to explain what had happened to me to the police, but they didn't believe me, chalking it up to delirium from my near-death experience. I was too weak and in too much pain to fight it either. My parents flew out to be with me, and it was decided that I would cut my road trip short and go back home with them. I haven't thought about LeBlanc since that night, and as much as I would like to keep it that way, today I got a package in the mail. Opening it up, it had no return address, and to my absolute shock and horror, it was the bag of books I had thrown at the window to break it. With it was a note. "Run, rabbit, run." No one is allowed to travel on the road after sundown. Growing up, I knew that something was off about my childhood town. For one, there was a list of unwritten, but mutually understood rules that we had to observe. These rules, in all honesty, were pretty much just cultural taboos passed down from the older generation. Things like not leaving the rice bucket empty, as it is a sign of being poor, and avoid shaking one's legs when sitting down, as it symbolizes shaking off good fortune, to name a few. Some of the rules were definitely a little on the creepy side though, like never hanging out clothes to dry overnight because dirty stuff may be attracted to them. But there was one particular rule that had always struck me as odd, I guess. The rule was simple and straightforward. No one is allowed to travel on the road after sundown. It didn't specify which road, but everyone generally took it to mean the twisting, narrow 2-lane road that led down the hill to the nearest city 30 miles away. It was the only connection between the town and the city, so during the day it would often become congested. The more experienced drivers, my father being one of them, would rush to the city and back in the final hours before sunset when the road was less crowded. But no matter what, once night fell, no one drove on the road. Not even my father, who'd rather sleep uncomfortably in his car overnight than to attempt the return trip home. One time, I asked him about the rule out of curiosity. He remained strangely quiet for a while before saying, "There are no street lights along the entire stretch of road, so it is dangerous to drive at night." I could tell from his eyes that he was hiding something else, so I tried pushing the question a little further. "Papa, why don't you just drive with the headlights on?" but my father simply shook his head. "It's too dangerous even with the headlights, Huey. When you become older and learn how to drive, y'all know why the road is so dangerous." I did grow older, but I never bothered learning how to drive, since my older brother already had a driver's license and inherited our family car. Unlike the rest of us, however, he never really cared about the rules since young, and much less the stupid driving ban, as he called it. My father caught him sneaking out of the house to drive late at night on more than one occasion, and it only got worse when he started dating a girl from the city. At some point, he just gave up and told my brother in the sternest tone I had ever heard from my father not to call home if he gets into any sort of trouble. My brother, of course, was over the moon. He loved to brag about how wonderful and freeing it was to speed along an empty road without a care in the world, and even persuaded me to go together with him a few times. I refused each time, though it would be a lie to say that I wasn't envious of him. But soon, my father's warning became a bizarre reality that I'm sure none of us would ever forget. It all started when my brother told us that he was going to bring his girlfriend over to our house, after she had knocked off work at 7 p.m. My father didn't say anything, but my mother uncharacteristically voiced out her concern. "Son, it's best to let her visit during the day." "Don't worry, Ma, she'll be staying overnight in my room," he said with a nonchalant wave of his hand. "Can is can, but not today. She won't be free till next weekend, Ma. It's all right, La." It was too obvious what my brother had in mind. I could only admire his tenacity as he hopped into our Toyota and screeched off into the vanishing sunset. Nothing seemed amiss at first, though my father and mother had a small argument in their bedroom that I couldn't catch before going to sleep early. Meanwhile, I was lying awake on my bed, secretly waiting for the sound of my brother's car to return so that I could sneak a glance at his mysterious girlfriend. "There's no way someone with his looks can land a pretty girl," was probably the thought running in my head when my ears caught the unmistakable ring of the telephone. Well, to be exact, my next-door neighbor's phone was the one ringing. Not many people could afford a landline back then, especially outside the major cities. My family hence borrowed my neighbor Ismail's phone whenever we needed to make or receive calls. Soon after the shrill ring stopped, Ismail knocked on our door loudly calling for my father. But despite him being a light sleeper, I couldn't hear the sound of my father getting out of bed to answer the door. I understood then that this was his way of teaching my brother a lesson. Ismail seemingly caught on to it too, because the knocks soon ceased and I heard him walking away from the door. I hesitated, wondering if it was really okay to leave my brother to his own devices and God knows where, before poking my head out of my bedroom window, which faced the road outside. A bang, was it from Kwan? "Oh, you're awake," Ismail exclaimed, though there was a grim look in his eyes. "Yes, his car has broken down somewhere below the hill. I'm going down to see if I can help him out. Are you coming along?" I agreed without a second thought and got into the front passenger seat of his silver cancel. Once we passed the last row of houses, it was as if the entire world had melted away. All I could see out of the windows was a thick, impenetrable fog of ink-eye black. Ismail seemed unfazed, however. "A bang, you haven't turned on the headlights," I said, panicking when I realized he was driving almost blindly at 60 kilometers and increasing. "No good," he replied calmly in Melayu. "The noise is already disturbing enough. The lights will anger them." I didn't dare to ask who exactly were we angering. We raced down the hill for what felt like an eternity in complete darkness, cornering so sharply at each twist and turn that the tiny hatchback seemed to skid on two wheels. It was only until we spotted two flashing amber lights in the distance that Ismail finally put his foot on the brake. "That's our car." I pointed at the Toyota parked by the roadside with its hazard lights on. "Yes, I see it," Ismail muttered, "but I don't see anyone in the driver's seat." Ha. But sure enough, when we neared the stranded Toyota, my brother was nowhere to be found. Instead, a girl sat in the front passenger seat, visibly shaken but otherwise unhurt. She didn't seem to react to our presence when Ismail stopped beside the car and rolled down his window. "You all right?" he shouted. When she didn't make a move, he pressed the horn until she finally turned her head towards us. I couldn't quite tell her facial expression because of how dark it was, but an inexplicable shudder ran down my spine when I felt her gaze on me. "Are you here to help?" she spoke in a bare whisper. "Where is Quan?" Ismail asked back, his voice becoming sharper all of a sudden. "Where did he go?" Her hand slowly gestured towards the pitch-black road ahead of us. Ismail paused for a moment before turning towards me. "You stay here with the girl." "I will. Go find Quan on foot myself." Wait, a bang. By the time I fumbled with my seat belt and finally unbuckled it, he was long gone. The only saving grace was that he had left the key in the ignition, so I had the engine idling noise and the meager light from the dashboard to accompany me in the dark. Well, there was also the girl, but something about her felt extremely. "Huey, can you see them? There, behind your car." Her whispery voice startled me. I was about to question how in the world did she know my name, but curiosity got the better of me, and I turned my head around to glance at the rear window. At first, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to see, but then the hazard lights from my brother's car flashed, and for a split second, I caught something stretching across the width of the road. What the hell was that? The hazard lights flashed again, and I could now make out the something to be shadowy wisps floating in a single row. My scream froze in my throat as the lights flashed once more, revealing 6 distinct humanoid figures standing shoulder to shoulder. And with every flash, the figures came closer and closer, their ghostly appearances becoming clearer and more defined. I was snapped out of my fright by a loud rap on the window. "Huey, hurry up and unlock the car door." I blinked, and the figures vanished as though they were never there to begin with. Somehow I managed to find the knob to release the door lock in the dark, and Ismail tossed my brother's limp body into the back seat with a grunt. I let out a gasp. Is he okay?" "Help, but they played a pretty bad prank on your brother," he said, settling into the driver's seat and starting the engine. "No choice but to leave your car here, so tell your parents to meet me in the morning. I can drive them down here to get the car back." "Okay." I hesitated before gathering the courage to ask, "Who are you talking about, a bang?" "Ah, right, you haven't been born yet when it happened," he said quietly. "Long time ago, this road formed part of a highway that went all the way to the capital. A lot of vehicles from the north used this road to get there, and because of the many sharp turns, it was easy to lose control if you weren't paying attention. Many accidents happened here as a result. One night, a long-distance bus was traveling on this exact road with 7 passengers, all high school students on a holiday trip to the capital. The driver was new to the road, and while overtaking another vehicle, he noticed that there was a bend ahead too late and couldn't stop the bus in time. He pointed at the road ahead absent-mindedly, so he jumped out through the driver's door, and the bus with the 7 passengers crashed right down into a ravine. The ravine was too steep and deep to attempt a rescue, so in the end, everyone on the bus was presumed dead. The bus was never recovered, however, and to this day it's rumored that their bodies are still lying somewhere down there, waiting to be found. That's horrible. I couldn't help but shudder. So just now, those figures must have been. "You saw them?" Ismail mumbled. "How many did you see?" How many?" I said in surprise. 6, I think." Something clicked in my mind then, and I started. "Wait, one's missing." "No," he whispered as he stared at the rear-view mirror. "The girl." I frantically turned to check on my brother in the back seat, but a hand shot out and stopped my head in place. "Huey, no," Ismail said in a low voice. "Don't look." That was the first time I've ever seen true fear in someone else's eyes. Forcing my saliva down my suddenly dry throat, I sunk into my seat and lowered my gaze to the best of my ability. Ismail turned the car around and began the journey back. Yet this time, we were struggling to gain momentum uphill even in first gear. It felt like the car had become several times heavier than on our way down, and I was more than certain my scrawny and underweight brother wasn't the cause of it. "A bang, what should we do?" I muttered so softly that I thought he wouldn't catch what I was saying. "They won't hurt us," he answered, though his voice was strained. Then he began murmuring something under his breath. Some sort of prayer chant, if I were to guess. The car suddenly jerked from side to side at that very moment, as if something heavy was thrashing about in the back seat. It took every fiber in my being not to scream out loud in panic. I swore I heard laughter from behind before the shaking abruptly stopped. Ismail didn't waste another moment and slammed the pedal to the metal, sending the cancel flying up the road at breakneck speed. If not for his driving experience, I wouldn't doubt for a second that we would have long ended up in a ravine too. It was only when the lights of the town appeared in the distance that we finally slowed down, and when Ismail pulled up next to our house, my father was already waiting by the front door. The two men exchanged a knowing look, and after thanking Ismail for his help, my father effortlessly hoisted my brother out of the car and into our living room. It wouldn't be until the next day when my brother finally regained consciousness. Bizarrely, the last thing he remembered was the engine mysteriously dying on the way back home and him exiting the car to open up the hood. He couldn't recall ever calling Ismail to ask for help. And I soon realized there was no way for him to make a call in the first place, since there were no payphones along the road. As for his girlfriend, apparently she had fallen ill and was forced to stay at home, so he didn't manage to meet up with her at all that night. Oddly enough, however, my brother has avoided driving on that particular road since then. It wasn't until recently, when a new highway to the city that completely bypasses the old road was completed, that he suggested going on a night drive together out of the blue. I was so surprised that I agreed without a second thought. It wasn't until I sat down in the front passenger seat that I suddenly remembered the incident from many years ago, and it occurred to me just how strange my brother's change of heart was. "So, what's up?" I asked him curiously. "What makes you want to drive at night again after so long?" "Oh, I never stopped wanting to go on night drives," he said nonchalantly. "It's just that for the longest time, I keep on having the same nightmare about the old road, and it seriously makes me hate driving on that road to my very core." I laughed. "A nightmare?" "Yeah, it's honestly super weird," he muttered. "It's always the same bus going down the same stretch of road, and I always find myself in the driver's seat no matter what I do." My smile faded. After overtaking a car in front, I must jump out to save myself or else I'll die in a deep ravine. Man, the screams at the end are the worst, I swear. They never fail to wake me up in cold sweat. My neighbor is a serial killer, and now I can finally prove it. So, I moved into my house just about 8 years ago. It's a small townhome in a completely boring development in small-town Minnesota, about half an hour south of Minneapolis. My block has 6 identical buildings, each holding 8 three-story townhomes. It looks as though God was playing The Sims, and rather than build each sim a unique house, he just copy-plus-pasted the first one until the block was full. I was lucky enough to get an end unit, but it faces the building next to mine, that unit being a mirror image of my own, with just about 12 feet of shared lawn between our front doors. If you look beyond the monotony of living in copycat houses, my new home suited me just fine, and my only concern was the close proximity of so many neighbors. I like to keep to myself, preferring the company of my dogs above other humans, and I had no interest in meeting, let alone befriending any of my new neighbors. I would have been perfectly content for everyone to think I was a hermit. My family helped me move in, repaint and install new carpet throughout the house, and do some decorating, but after about a week of work they were finally about to leave, and I could begin to really settle into my new space. It was getting late, and we were saying our prolonged Minnesota goodbyes at the door when my mom turned and noticed that my neighbor's kitchen light was on. "Huh," she mused. "That is the first time I've seen any signs of life in that house all week." I thought it was vacant, but maybe he's just a nighttime guy. "Or a serial killer," my dad joked. "Oh great, I won't need to watch any more true crime on TV if it's happening right next door." I laughed. As we had been moving my things in, I had noticed that every window on my neighbor's unit always had the blinds down, but I hadn't really paid much mind to it until then. It seemed strange, especially since every other home in the neighborhood had their windows wide open to enjoy the cool autumn air. But I understood the desire for privacy, so I didn't really question it. I found that I enjoyed my new neighborhood more than I expected. It was quiet, and thankfully it seemed as though the rest of the neighbors were as happy to remain anonymous as I was. There was no welcome wagon, no Susie homemakers showing up with cookies and gossip about Betaloo whomever, and no drunken bonfires in Barb and Dale's driveway every other night while the boys are back in town, unironically blares from the old boombox in their garage. You laugh, but that's a thing that actually happens around here pretty regularly, so it was a genuine concern. The boys never left town, Dale. You all grew up here and you will all die here. But I digress. Months passed, and I noticed that nothing ever seemed to change at the house next door. My kitchen sink sits directly underneath the window, so any time I got a glass of water, filled up a bucket for cleaning, or stood there scrubbing dishes, I had nowhere to look but directly at my neighbor's house. From that vantage point, I could see his back patio, kitchen window, front door, the window to his upstairs landing, and most of his driveway. The blinds on every window stayed down, and the window at the door was covered with something as wallpaper of some sort, it looked like. No one ever seemed to be coming or going. There was no patio furniture or flowers like so many of my neighbors had, and the trash and recycling were never put out. Every so often, though, the kitchen light would be on. Always the kitchen light. Only the kitchen light. I tend to keep odd hours myself, and I noticed that the light was never on at the same time, or on any discernible schedule, sometimes 10 p.m., sometimes 1 a.m., sometimes 4 a.m. Eventually, I just assumed that the unit actually was vacant, and someone had left the light on an oddly programmed timer. It was more fun to joke about the serial killer that lived next door, though. He's back. I would text my dad with a blurry photo of the illuminated kitchen window. Hope the dogs are guarding the door, he would joke. He doesn't like to admit it, but my dad has always been a little uneasy around my German Shepherd and Doberman, Rex and Rook. They're the sweetest dogs ever, and honestly, big babies that would probably either hide or befriend an actual intruder. But I know he feels better knowing that I have them around. I'm just a young, single woman, living alone in the suburbs after all. I was surely in all kinds of danger. Eventually the joke spread to my closest friends, and sometimes even directly to Facebook or Twitter. Every time I noticed the kitchen light on, I would text a friend or post that my serial killer neighbor was home, usually to an unenthusiastic response. He's not a serial killer, he probably just works nights. Having a light on at 4 a.m. doesn't make him a serial killer. It makes him an insomniac. Maybe he thinks you're the serial killer. You're the one always spying on his window, after all. My friends made valid points, I'll give them that. It was nearly 5 years after moving in, and long after most of my friends were sick of my jokes, that there was a break in the case. It was already nearly midnight, and I still had a bit of work to do, so I decided to refuel with a coffee. All was quiet as I padded down to my kitchen, and popped a K-cup into my Keurig, Rex, and Rook following on my heels. While waiting for my coffee to brew, I retrieved their water bowl and went back to the sink to fill it up. But as I turned on the faucet, I glanced out of the window and dropped the bowl, gasping in surprise. The neighbor's house had been completely dark just 1 second ago, but now the kitchen light had come to life, and through the blinds I could see the silhouette of a man standing at the window. I stood there, paralyzed for a moment, as the silhouette seemed to lean closer to the window. He could see me. Somehow he could see me. I was sure of it. Instantly, I dropped to the floor and crawled over to the switch to turn my lights off. Without any light in my home to reveal my presence, I mustered the courage to slowly move into a crouching position and peek back through the window. He was gone. Well, at least his light was off again. He could just as easily be standing there in the dark as well, watching me as I peered into the darkness looking for him. Now not being able to see him made me uneasy. I tried to put the strange encounter out of my mind, but the coffee probably wasn't my best idea because I was up and jittery for the rest of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that night, I felt like I always needed to be on guard in my own home. When I would see his kitchen light on, I would always rush to turn my lights off and stand there silently in the dark, waiting for something to happen. I didn't see the silhouette again, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. I didn't tell my family or friends about what had happened either. They would have thought I was just being dramatic. I would still joke about the serial killer next door from time to time, but it was starting to feel less like a joke. I began to watch the house more closely from every vantage point I had. Sometimes I would linger at my kitchen window to see if he would reappear. When I got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, I would peer down through the window at the landing to see if his light was on. When I would come home late at night, I would pause at the window by the front door, expecting him to be standing on the other side of it. Despite my hypervigilance, it was more than a year before I saw him again. I'm not usually the type to just sit outside, especially in the summer mosquito season, but on one surprisingly cool evening in July, I decided to sit on my front steps and enjoy the uncharacteristically nice weather. The sun had not quite begun to set, and I had Rex on a long leash while he sniffed around for the perfect place to do his business based on the location of the moon in relation to the ley lines or whatever. I was distracted on my phone when an unfamiliar sound made me snap to attention. Rex was growling. I wasn't kidding when I said this dog was a baby. He's 70 pounds of wuss. The few times I've had people over to my house, he would usually run away and hide. I had never seen him display any kind of aggression toward anyone in his life. But here he was, growling, hair on his back standing straight up, and teeth bared at an unfamiliar man standing just a few yards away. I hadn't even heard him approach. The stranger looked so quintessentially suburban vanilla, if you will. He was white, clean-shaven, somewhere just shy of 6 feet tall. I guessed he was around 25 to 30 years old. He had short, dark brown hair peeking out from under a navy Minnesota Twins baseball cap, and wore mid-washed denim jeans, a plain light gray t-shirt, and sneakers. He wasn't especially well built, but he definitely had some muscle. His face was long, with a strong jaw, slightly crooked nose, and small, but very intense, brown eyes, and they were staring directly at me. I stood up and the stranger glanced somewhat nervously back at Rex, who was crouched low, ready to lunge, before meeting my gaze again. I could tell that Rex's presence had disoriented him a bit, but he managed to relax his face and appear calm, friendly, almost. If it weren't for the oddly intense look in his eyes and Rex's reaction, I may not have perceived him as a threat at all. "I didn't know that you had a dog," he said, cocking his head slightly to the side. I was too on edge in the moment to register just how strange his statement was, or that he had completely skipped over any introductions or pleasantries. There was something so strange about the look in his eyes. "Have you had him very long?" The way he spoke was unusual. There was a certain precision to his words, but his tone was unusually casual, as though he knew me. Since he was a puppy," I answered, taking a small step back toward my door. "He's very loyal, I see." The stranger cocked his head toward the other side and smiled a wide, closed-mouthed smile, the look in his eyes never changing. I was startled and cut off as Rook suddenly jumped up at the window by the front door, barking viciously at the stranger. "Oh," the stranger said, taking a step back and straightening up. "You have 2 dogs." I didn't know what to say anymore. Rook was clawing at the door so forcefully that I thought he might actually break through it. Rex's growling grew louder, and there was foaming drool dripping from his mouth. Well, I had better get going. He turned and walked down toward the garage of the neighboring townhome. Just before rounding the corner, he turned back and smiled widely. "You have a nice day." I heard the garage door close a moment later, pulled Rex inside with me, and after making sure that the door was locked, slid down to sit on the floor. Both dogs were whining, pushing each other's heads out of the way to get a better view from the window. I was thankful for their vigilance, but so shaken that I took them both up to my bedroom, locked that door, and called my friend Marie to tell her what had happened. "What a creep," Marie said, as I wrapped up the story. "Rex and Rook have never acted that way, Marie. What if he actually is a serial killer?" "That seems a little dramatic." She laughed. "He definitely sounds weird, but that doesn't mean he actually murders people." "Okay, but you didn't see the look in his eyes. Something is really wrong with this guy." She didn't understand. She hadn't seen what I saw or felt what I felt. How can you explain to someone that you just know in your soul that someone is a killer? One day this is going to be on the news, I said defiantly. You know how they always interview the neighbors when something like this happens? They always say things like, "Oh, he was such a sweet young man. He seemed so normal." I never could have guessed. Well, I guessed. If he doesn't actually kill me, I'll be the first person to tell the reporters that I knew all along that my neighbor was a serial killer. I have killer instincts. Killer instincts, she snorted. Killer instincts. I'm glad she thought it was so funny, but I was taking this seriously. After that day, I became even more vigilant. I also decided to do some online snooping. I consider myself to be a kind of low-rent private eye. I can find just about anything about anyone with a few Google searches, so it wasn't long before I had his name. Derek Johnson. I found his Facebook account and a LinkedIn page that said he was self-employed. Serial Killers R Us wasn't hiring, I suppose. He had an average number of friends on Facebook, and some of his older photos hadn't been set to private, so I skimmed through them looking for clues. I noticed that he was better looking than I had realized. A bit of a Ted Bundy wannabe, if you ask me. Another Google search revealed that Derek currently owned 2 properties, the house next door, and the other, a larger property in a neighboring town, which was listed as his actual residence. Clearly the townhome was his murder house. My mind continued to build the story with facts from my surveillance, whatever information I could find through my Google searches, and perhaps a little added drama. I recalled how, even in the middle of winter, the heat at his home had never been on. But then the AC had started running sometime around the end of April. Why would he need it so cold? Unless the entire house was just a massive cooler. I deduced that he must be a cannibal. I was sure that I had picked up some Dahmer vibes. As I continued my research and surveillance, I started to see Derek or signs of him more frequently. A few times there was a car in the driveway, a large, dark-colored 4-door sedan. I noted the ample trunk space perfect for transporting groceries, IKEA bodies. On one occasion, I saw Derek on his patio. He had a small fire pit and was sweeping some kind of pebbles or sand from the patio and dumping it into the fire. No, not sand. It must be crushed up bone. What else would he do with them otherwise? It's not like you can just pull a Gacy and recklessly bury skeletons on your property these days. And what could it be if not bone fragments? You don't see anyone else sweeping their patios and burning the sand, do you? You only do that if you have something to hide. Whenever I witnessed him coming or going, it was always at odd hours. At one point my mom had suggested that he was simply getting the place ready to rent out. But who shows up at 1 a.m. to do work on their rental house? And without ever bringing any tools or supplies. A friend guessed that perhaps he was a phone sex operator and saw the most traffic late at night. But since when does a phone sex operator need a whole house to do the job? Rocco did it from a cubicle, for God's sake. Nothing else made sense. Derek was a serial killer. I was certain. I just needed actual proof. I was updating Marie on the latest goings on one night when she hit me with her own theory. He's just like you, she said, matter-of-factly. What? Did my best friend just call me a serial killer? He must be a writer like you, she answered triumphantly. It makes perfect sense. You both have kind of weird hours because you can work whenever. You prefer to be alone so you don't get distracted. Oh, I said, relieved. Right. Sure. I guess that makes some sense. It's a decent guess. I don't think he's a writer, though. If you say so, she sighed. I did say so. But I will admit that she had the most logical explanation yet. Still, I knew he wasn't a writer. I can spot one of my own. And anyway, now I know I was right. 3 nights ago, I was at my usual perch by the kitchen window when something new happened next door. Around 2:30 a.m., the dark sedan pulled into the driveway. The lights turned off, the engine cut, and Derek exited the driver's side. He didn't head straight into the garage, though, but instead walked around the car and opened the passenger door. A girl, oh my God, I whispered to myself. The girl stumbled a little bit as she climbed out of the car, but Derek caught her. He said something and she laughed, leaning into him a little more. She was clearly drunk, or drugged. Either way, she was not thinking straight and had clearly fallen into a dangerous situation. She was young, no more than 21. It was just after bar close, so he easily could have picked her up at one of the local bars. She had long blonde hair, don't they always, and was wearing a short dress with a floral pattern. It would have looked very sweet and innocent if it wasn't so low cut. She looked like just about every other young girl in town, but I imagined that we would all have her face burned into our memories when it was on every local news channel and printed on the front page of the paper. I could see the headline now. Young woman missing, presumed dead. I watched from the window as he helped the girl inside, and the light faded from the garage as the door rolled down. I waited for a few minutes, but the kitchen light never came on, nor did any other. Maybe you don't need lights for what they're doing. Maybe she never made it out of the garage. I stayed up for another hour or so, periodically checking back at the window. No change. I didn't hear any screaming either, so I decided to just go to bed, telling myself that my imagination really had run too far this time. By the time I woke the next morning, afternoon, the sedan was gone. I still felt uneasy, so I spent the day re-examining my evidence. In all of my surveillance, I had never seen Derek bring someone back to the house, at least not someone that was still walking, however clumsily. That didn't mean that he hadn't had people in that very large trunk, though. On more than one occasion I had seen that sedan arrive, only to hide away in the garage rather than sitting in the driveway. But on that track, why would he let that girl get out of the car in the driveway? If he could have pulled the car into the garage and not risked someone seeing her. Maybe he knows I've been watching. Maybe he wanted me to see. Then again, I thought, maybe I actually am just being overly dramatic. I started to consider that maybe this was just a house that Derek kept to sleep around. I hadn't uncovered any marriage records in all of my online sleuthing, but that didn't mean that he wasn't living with a fiancé or girlfriend at his other house, and using this as a place to go when he wanted a little fun with some drunk, lonely townie. The day got away from me, as it's wont to do when you arise after noon, and before I knew it, it was getting dark outside and I hadn't eaten all day. I decided to go see what leftovers I had left in the fridge, but as I turned the corner into my kitchen and flicked the lights on, I stopped dead in my tracks. For the first time in almost 8 years, the blinds on Derek's kitchen window were open and standing at the window was the girl. I've never seen such terror in someone's eyes. She was desperately pulling at the window, but obviously too panicked to realize it was locked. Her face was badly beaten, her left eye swollen shut and lips split so deeply it looked as though it could have been cut with scissors. You almost couldn't tell that her hair was blonde with all of the blood. It was stuck to her face in several places where the blood had begun to dry, but she clearly didn't have time to be concerned with how her hair looked. Her dress was also badly stained and ripped in several places. No amount of Tide was saving it. Probably also not her greatest concern. It seemed like I stood there for several minutes trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it must have been only seconds before she noticed me. I saw a spark of hope flash in her one functioning eye. She started frantically waving and hitting at the window. Her mouth was wide, repeatedly calling out, "Help! Help me!" He must have had some top-notch soundproofing done in that house, because I couldn't hear a thing. Her right hand was bloody and left streaks and splatters on the glass each time she hit it. I could see that her pointer finger on that hand was missing entirely. She was so distracted with begging me for help that she didn't seem to hear Derek coming up behind her, but my eyes locked on him immediately. He moved slowly, deliberately, so as not to spook his prey. He was bleeding from his head as well. The girl must have hit him with something in her attempt to escape, but clearly she hadn't swung hard enough. As he crept closer, his gaze suddenly shifted from the panicked young girl to me, and he paused, smiling. His eyes had the same fiery look that they'd had that day in my yard, and suddenly I realized what it was. Hunger. It was hunger. He raised his left hand and dangled something as though he wanted to show it off to me, the girl's missing finger. Without breaking eye contact, he raised the finger to his lips, sucking on the severed end. After a moment he closed his eyes, clearly enjoying the hors d'oeuvre. My eyes widened and a familiar wave rolled through my stomach. I bent over the sink for a second, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back. This is it. This is the moment that confirms all of my suspicions. Suddenly, the girl stopped and stood very still. Maybe she had heard him behind her. I wanted her to know that I could see her, that I could see what was happening to her, so I took a step toward the window, looked directly into her eyes, and nodded. Relief washed over her face for a moment, but it didn't last. Her functioning eye narrowed, and she tilted her head ever so slightly in confusion as I calmly reached into the drawer next to the sink, retrieved a fork and knife, and held them up for her to see, for both of them to see. I think she did finally understand, though, in her final moments, as Derek's knife slid effortlessly across the flesh of her throat. I was coming for dinner. My new neighbor has been watching me from my closet, so I had hauled up the last of my belongings to my new apartment. I dropped my black trash bag full of clothes on the floor and surveyed the bare surroundings of my new home. The walls were beige with stray stains randomly dotted from God knows what from the previous tenants that the owners didn't finish cleaning. The carpet had a coarseness that I could feel even beneath the thick soles of my shoes and gave off the faint aroma of cigarette smoke. There was going to be a lot of work for me to make this dingy unit somewhat habitable. A day later, I was already feeling buyer's remorse for taking this place immediately. Either the property owners were trying their best to unload this dump as quick as they could, or I was desperate enough to sign off on it, thinking that it wouldn't be so bad. The feeling changed when I had a good look at my new neighbor living right next door to me. She turned to greet me, and I immediately averted my gaze downward. I certainly found her attractive, but my natural shyness took over. She stopped me, and I somehow managed to look her in her beautiful hazel eyes that almost hypnotized me. "I said you just moved here, right?" she asked me, while I marveled at the melody in her speaking voice. Yes, I did," I stammered, the words almost stalling in my throat. Being an introverted person, I'm not used to people randomly talking to me on the rare moments it does happen. But when it's a beautiful person like she was, my anxiety becomes hard to manage. And yet, here she was, talking to me and even giving me a perfectly pearly white smile. Before I knew it, I extended my arm for her and "I'm Josh" slipped out, and I cursed myself in my mind. Now she had to think you're a weirdo, I thought. She grabbed my hand and shook it, the skin of her palm radiating a warmth that traveled through and up my arm. "Hi, I'm Lena," she told me. She looked back at me, and I attempted to smile back despite my embarrassment. I was suddenly glad to be on good terms with my new neighbor, but I worried about coming off as too obvious, and I told her, "Well, see you later," I timidly ended. I beat my head against the door, cursing myself, stupid, like a lovesick high schooler who ended any chance with the biggest crush he ever had. After that, I expected she'd never talk to me again, not even looking my way again. So when she showed up at my door with a bag of takeout, to say I was surprised would be the biggest understatement in my lifetime. "Just wanted to surprise you with some excellent food. I spent all day making it." She winked as she said this, and I felt my face almost burn red. We got to know each other over the next couple hours, and little by little, I opened up to her, which was a first for me. I still felt a little reserved, but I could relax knowing that she didn't think I was a complete dork. I even cracked a few lame jokes, and she laughed like she was watching me perform stand-up. It seemed like it ended so quick, and she left. She promised she'd see me soon. Even though I was left alone in my less than stellar living space, I was glad for such great company. I went to sleep later, my bed situated right across from my closet. My closet was empty, aside from the few shirts I had hanging inside, and the door was shut. This was a superstition I had that I never quite grew out of. It was in the early morning hours when I had just randomly woken up that I heard it. I realized what it was, and my sleepy eyes had bulged out of my sockets. From across my bed, I could hear the faint but unmistakable rhythm of breathing. There was someone in my room, just across my bed. I pulled my blankets closer like it was a shield protecting me from the intruder. I didn't dare move, didn't dare to breathe, praying that whoever was here would just walk away. My alarm clock sat next to me, its soft green glow the only source of illumination in my room, and I was desperately hoping it wasn't bright enough to expose my face. The minutes ticked by slowly while the pounding in my heart grew rapidly and harsher with every changing second. All the while, the breathing never faltered or grew louder. Just the steady exchange of oxygen of someone overlooking my sleeping form. The minutes ticked by for what felt like a long eternity with no change. I was summoning enough courage to try to look in the direction of my intruder. I turned my eyes over, and my fears were confirmed. From what I could make out in the darkness, my closet door was not closed like it was, but wide open. Inside, I could make out the crouched form of a person sitting, watching me from across my room. I wanted to scream to confront this person, but my fear kept me paralyzed and had my vocal cords in a stranglehold. All I could do was lay there as this figure stayed hunched over and breathing. I don't know how I managed to fall back asleep. I woke up to the sun's rays breaking through the window, the dawn being a welcome sight. I looked back at my closet, and it was closed just like how I left it the previous night. I took a moment to calm down and rationalize that it was just a nightmare. Maybe a case of that sleep paralysis that I heard about online. It took me a while to get myself out of bed and out for my routine. I got to work, operating on autopilot throughout the day. I finally made it home, and Lena was walking opposite of me. "How was your first night?" she inquired and looked at my sleepy-deprived face. "You look like you didn't sleep well." I wanted to tell her about the weird dream I had, and maybe get a hug from her while she tells me it's gonna be all right. I just, had a rough night. First night jitters and all. As I said this, my eyes kept darting between her and off to the side. As much as I wanted to admire her, I felt so intimidated being in her presence, and I didn't feel worthy to. "Well, I won't be out long, so let me know if you need anything," she waved delicately as he walked away. I was glad for her offer, and I tried to put the whole nightmare out of my mind completely. I was going to bed again later that night, and I made sure the closet door was shut. No way it could open from the inside, right? There was nothing else inside either. No way this could happen again. I woke up the same time in the night, and I felt dread flood in my body as I again heard the soft breathing from my closet. My eyes darted, and this time I dared to move my whole head toward my closet. Door wide open. The intruder hunched over inside. My breathing became quick and shallow, as if all oxygen in my room was depleted. I stared down at whoever was in my closet as they coolly remained still. I froze like a deer watching upcoming headlights of imminent demise as I waited for this nightmare to charge at me. But it never did. They just kept sitting there, breathing softly. The reality had set in that this wasn't a nightmare, that there was a person sitting in my closet, watching me from the shadows. I watched for hours until I noticed the dawn begin to bleed into my bedroom. In that half a second, I looked away, the figure had vanished. This time, the closet door was still open, a sign that this was in fact real. I walked inside for any other indication that someone was inside during the night. There was nothing there. I was both so afraid because I had an intruder staring at me from my closet and frustrated at myself for being too afraid to do anything. I decided to do something about it, and I would catch whoever it was in the act. I had gone in search of anything that would help me, and I settled on a modest setup but hopefully would help me out. I picked the last item I needed when I felt a hand grip my shoulder, and I had nearly jumped 10 feet in the air. "Whoa, sorry about that." Lena greeted me with her usual vibrance. "Didn't mean to scare you like that, just trying to say hi." "Oh, that's all right," I said, trying to get my heart rate to slow down. "I'm not great when people sneak up on me like that." "Oh well, that's a problem, because sneaking up on people is what I do best," she said with a sly smirk. She was devious, but I couldn't help finding it cute. She walked around with me for a while, and being in her presence made me forget about everything for a bit. I genuinely didn't want to go back to my apartment with whoever waited for me to fall asleep. I wanted to keep talking to Lena, get to know her even more, get her to like me more. Regretfully, we had to part ways, and she promised that we'd meet up again soon. Back in my room, I set up my makeshift surveillance system. A camera and a motion-activated light had to do, but it turned out to be all I needed. I had everything ready by the time I went to sleep, until I had woken moments ago. I woke up to a brightness in my eyes and the breathing again. My camera was pointed right in view of my closet and was recording whoever was inside and had a light on them. I primed myself to finally confront the intruder, call 911, and that would be the end of it. I bolted upright, ready to defend myself, and immediately my confidence shattered and my resolve was drained when I saw who was inside. Lena had been squatting in my closet in plain view, glowering at me in a way I had never seen her do, or thought she was capable of. I would say it's Lena I'm looking at, but at the same time it's not. The way she was hunched over, her skeletal legs were elongated. Her arms were just as long and taut around her forearms and ended in 5 sharp blades of her fingernails. Her face. Oh God, her face as I'm looking at it now is straight from my nightmares. Her grin looks horseshoe-shaped, it stretched impossibly long across her face. Her eyes have a malice to them, a predator toying with its food in prolonged torture before devouring it whole. I'm watching her now as she keeps staring back at me. She's standing straight up. She's impossibly tall, the top of her head nearly touching the ceiling. She's walking towards me. Strands of drool are hanging off her teeth. Help me. I swear I'm not being that pedantic, Whole neighbor. Noise ordinance starts at 10 p.m. and most people respect it because there are a lot of young kids in the neighborhood. But my neighbor across the street is remodeling his house, and last Wednesday, he started cutting things at 10:30 p.m. It sounded like metal. A high, shrill whine that easily penetrated the walls of my house and doubtless carried throughout the nearby vicinity. I thought, okay, maybe he's running a little behind and desperately needs to get this done to meet some schedule. It is getting cold pretty fast, after all, or maybe he's got some professionals coming out and something needs to be done before then. I try to be a good neighbor and give people some tolerance. 11 p.m. rolled around. He kept working. That infernal screech, then a brief lull of silence. Each time he paused, I thought that maybe he was done and I could go to bed, and then he'd start again. I wondered if I should call the police. I wondered if they'd even care. A noise complaint seems pretty trivial, especially since this was only one night. It wasn't like he had a habit of being noisy. That rationalization didn't make it any easier to sleep. I tossed in my bed for about 30 minutes before I gave up. I went to the living room to watch TV in the hopes that it'd distract me enough to sleep. It didn't work. The screech of the saw cut right through the dialogue of the movie I'd put on, shattering my idle concentration. The longer it went, the angrier I got. Then, around 12:30 a.m., the noise stopped for a full 15 minutes. I sat on my living room sofa, listening intently, hoping that I could finally get to sleep. Another shrill whine, somehow louder this time, and I jumped to my feet, threw the remote across the room, and screamed some profanities at the wall. I still didn't call the police. I wasn't ready for a confrontation. I was trying to be patient. But honestly, I was sort of hoping that someone else would be the one to call in a complaint. It was highly likely. Someone kept calling the police on another neighbor because they don't like how he parks his pickup truck with the trailer in front of his house. Which I think is ridiculous. He runs his own lawn care business. This isn't some hoity-toity white-collar neighborhood with a HOA that tells you what color your slate shingles have to be so all the houses have a uniform look when viewed from the nearby golf course. I'm so tired. I'm rambling. Shockingly, whoever they are, they didn't call the police. So I just dealt with the noise until 1 a.m. when it finally stopped for good. I messaged my coworkers something about my asshole neighbor, and possibly being in late. The timestamp on the message would explain everything, and then I threw myself into bed and fell right asleep. I did pretty good the next day. got up at my usual time through sheer habit, and kept going with the help of coffee. Napped a little when I got home. I talked to my next-door neighbor, the one with the pickup with the trailer, when I went out to check the mail. They'd been kept up by the noise too, and were surprised no one complained. The neighbors right next door to the offender had a young kid, after all, who was surely unable to sleep through the racket. But we both agreed that it was probably a one-off occurrence and not worth a confrontation. It wasn't. The noise started around midnight. I was already asleep, and the screech of an electric saw jerked me awake. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my dark room, wondering what sort of suburban hell I was currently living in. Did I dare go over there and confront him? Risk souring the peaceful relationship I had with my neighbor? We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. I've been here 6 years without problems. I'd do it diplomatically, I thought. Explain why this was troublesome to me, and then ask for his reason for working so late. Maybe suggest he'd do all the power tool work over the upcoming weekend. Or at the very least, find out how much longer he'd be using the electric saw and decide if I could live with that and buy some earplugs the next morning. I put on my shoes, got a jacket, and put my cell phone in my pocket. Then I went over. The garage door was up and his car was parked in the street, leaving the driveway and garage interior open. The overhead light was on and a small floodlight was positioned to further illuminate his workspace. The driveway shone with liquid, glassy under the streetlight, running out from the puddle on the garage floor and down to the gutter. This seemed odd until I realized what he was cutting. Tile. He was using a wet saw. A stack of uncut tiles were stacked along the side of the garage. I waited until a lull in which he set aside the 2 pieces of tile and turned to pick up another. It was a large pile. How much of his house was he tiling, I wondered. We have the same floor plan. The bathrooms and kitchen are quite small. Excuse me, I said into the silence. I just wanted to ask how much longer you'll be needing to use the saw. Start polite. Don't turn it into a confrontation right away. I can't tell you how glad I am, because after I spoke up, he turned around to face me and my insides seized up with cold terror. He wasn't human. There's no other explanation. His body was human, his hands were human, but his head, like a wolf almost. Pointed ears that were too perfectly triangular, devoid of hair, and the rest of the fur was short and bristly, like it had been scorched. I could see pale flesh beneath in the patches where it was worn away. The skull was flattened like the entire thing had been compressed, squashing the eye sockets away into thin, black lines of folded flesh. The skin receded from the jaw, revealing white gums and ivory teeth that glistened and dripped with saliva. Yes, he croaked at me, his jaw splitting open, and there was no tongue and no throat, only an inky darkness inside. It took a moment before I could find my voice. He looked at me expectantly with eyes that weren't there. The noise, I stammered. Well, I need to get this done, he replied defensively, gesturing vaguely at the tiles. My eyes instinctively tracked his hand and settled on the stack of uncut tile. The color was hideous, a fleshy pink interspersed with patches of darker red and an occasional straight line or knob of white. There was something disturbingly fascinating about the tile, and I stared intently at it, trying to comprehend why its appearance seemed so familiar. Then he picked up one from the top of the stack, and the one beneath blinked at me. An eyeball was positioned near one corner. It stared at me, wide-eyed, and the corners of the eyelid brimmed with tears that pooled on the smooth surface of compressed flesh and muscle and bone. I glanced down at the liquid at my feet. It shone red in the light of the garage. And then he put the tile on the saw and started the blade, and I heard the scream of the saw and the scream of the mouth that was on the tile, shrieking in agony as he sliced it cleanly in half. He looked back up at me when that was done. I told him that it was fine, that I'd just get some earplugs, and I hoped he was able to get through his remodeling quickly. Then I went home and didn't sleep for the rest of the night, alternating between dry heaving in the bathroom, sobbing and screaming incoherently at the wall, as that infernal saw went on and on and on. I guess I should have called the police, but I confess I was not in a right state of mind. Morning came and I went to work only because I couldn't stand to remain in the neighborhood. I looked at the neighbor's driveway as I backed my car out. It was still damp and muddy water pooled along the curb. No blood. It was all just a product of my sleep-deprived brain, I told myself. On the way home from work, I bought some earplugs at the drugstore. Then I talked to my neighbor out by the mailbox again. He was thinking of having a word with the guy. I told him that was a terrible idea. Trust me, I said. I'd already tried. There were no power tools on Friday, nor for the rest of the weekend. I was deeply relieved. Whatever was going on, it was surely over. I kept looking out the window all weekend, hoping to catch a glimpse of my neighbor, and I finally did on Sunday. He looked normal. His face was a human face. More and more, I convinced myself that I'd imagined the entire thing. Maybe I dozed off on my sofa, and it was merely a hyper-realistic dream. Then on Monday, a stack of bricks was delivered to his driveway. And last night, the saw started up again. I remained in my house and peeked out the window through the curtains. It was 11 p.m. I could clearly see his triangular ears and the muzzle of his canine jaw. I'd spent the weekend reading up on the noise ordinance laws, so I knew we were well inside the applicable restrictions. All it would take was one phone call to the non-emergency line and an explanation that this was a consistent pattern now. I wouldn't even be that asshole neighbor by calling. He was the asshole. Then the next door neighbor, the one with a young kid, went over. I watched him, my breath tight in my chest. He's a big dude with intricate full-sleeve tattoos. Dresses as a Nazgul every year to pass out candy for Halloween, complete with a sword. Seems nice. He double-checked some electrical work I did on my house earlier this year, but otherwise we didn't talk a lot. The tattooed neighbor was visibly taken aback when he approached. He stared at the wolf man thing a moment, and they seemed to be talking. I couldn't hear what was being said, but the tattooed neighbor was growing more agitated as the conversation went on. He threw an arm out to point back at his house, and it was clear he was yelling at that point. Perhaps he was also sleep-deprived and making bad choices as a result, because I wasn't sure I'd have yelled at something clearly so inhuman. Or maybe that's just hindsight talking. I confess I felt some of his anger as I watched the scene. I just wanted a good night's sleep, for God's sake, and did he really have to be working on this project between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? The neighbor with the saw turned his head away, as if in submission. The tattooed neighbor paused in his tirade. And in that brief respite, the wolf thing rose up, drew his shoulders back, and his neck seemed to elongate, the muscle rippling and bulging, and he opened his mouth so wide the lower jaw flapped like a broken hinge, and then he bit my neighbor's head off. Blood fountained into the air, splattering over the saw, the bricks, and the garage as the body convulsed and then collapsed to the ground. I screamed and threw myself back away from the window. Then I was violently, horrifically sick as my entire body rebelled at the horror I'd just seen. It took a while before I could recover enough to look again. I was shaky, my muscles weak from exhaustion and nausea. Trembling, I drew back enough of the curtain that I could see my neighbor's garage. He was bent over the saw, running thick slabs of what seemed to be wood through it. My neighbor's body was gone. I didn't recall there being wood in his garage earlier. Then he picked up another piece and positioned it, and I saw that the whorls and rings in the wood looked like tattoos. He lowered the saw blade and blood poured forth, splattering on the ground and streaming down the driveway to the street. I called 911. Told them my neighbor has been using power tools late at night for a few days now, and that my neighbor had gone over and I'd heard fighting, and I was worried someone had been hurt in the confrontation. They arrived quickly and I paced my living room, watching the lights of the police cruiser dance across the back wall. The officer didn't talk long. Then he came to my house, since I'd reported it, and talked with me about what I'd heard. I wasn't terribly coherent. I apologized, explaining that I'd been unable to sleep through the noise. The officer was polite, and told me there was no sign that the argument had escalated further than just some yelling. He'd given the neighbor a warning about noise and told him to knock it off. I asked if he'd seen anything unusual. No, the officer said. He said I should get some sleep, I was clearly having a rough night. Then he left and I watched through the window as the neighbor closed the garage door. A half-cut tattooed plank still on the saw, slowly dripping blood from the open wound. My boss told me today that I should go home and sleep. I don't look well. My eyes are dark hollows in my face, ringed by blood spots from all that vomiting. I'm dizzy from the lack of sleep. I refused. I'm scared to go home. I'm considering getting a realtor and just moving. But then what would happen to the person that moved in? At least I know to stay the F away from the house across the street now. The police were back when I got home today. They were talking to the neighbor with the small child. The wife, this time. Her eyes were red from crying. I didn't have to overhear the conversation to know what was being said. He's missing. He didn't come home. The police searched the neighbor's house again, checking inside and checking the backyard, and I watched it the entire time, desperately hoping that they'd find something. But they didn't, because they came and talked to me again, and I cried a bit, and the detective was sympathetic and took notes of everything I said. I didn't say anything about the wolf thing. I just said the neighbor went next door to complain about the power tools. I heard yelling. That was all. It's 10:30 p.m. right now. I've been listening to the saw for the past half hour. I'm too afraid to even look and see what he's cutting. The sound of the saw reminds me of screaming, but I think that really is just my imagination this time. I've tried putting in earplugs, but it's not enough. I can still faintly hear it, and I'm too anxious to sleep, knowing what's out there. I'm getting a hotel room tomorrow night and every night until he finishes his remodeling.
Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.